Thank you very much. I'm so excited to be here with you guys today, and of course with Sugith, to kind of dive deeper into your career and discuss all things you, because you're the man of the hour, and we're here to to chat about you.
It took 40 years.
Well, of course, as the Reelworld staff mentioned, you are being awarded the Award of Excellence. Can you tell us a little bit about what that award means to you and to get it from Reelworld itself?
I'm still hoping for my big break. So it's a real thrill. I totally unexpected and really honored that Reelworld, who I've had an actual relationship with for a long time. I made a short film that was in the 2003 edition of Reelworld. So my history with Reelworld goes back to the Middle Ages, and and so it's great to have them bestow this unexpected honor on me.
Absolutely, really unexpected. Come on.
Trust me, I've been in Canadian show business for 40 years. That's like being in witness protection.
Let's dive a little bit into your career, let's start from the beginning. You began as a writer, of course, you dipped your toes into acting as well. Can you share the journey that led you to the transition to acting and what motivated you to change?
Well, I don't know if I changed. What really happened was I just wanted to be in the arts. I wanted to be working in film and TV. I didn't have an uncle who was a film producer. I didn't have a movie camera. This is, the late 70s, so there was no computer, there was no internet. I had a typewriter. So I figured, okay, I'll write a script, and somehow that will be the first step in getting into film and TV. Back then, of course, there were no screenplays to even read. Like there's like 6,000 of them on the internet now, but back then I had to go to a bookstore, and I found 2 published paperback screenplays, which I still have today. One was Citizen Kane, and the other was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And I read those and sort of deconstructed them and figured out, okay, this is how you write a screenplay, by reading those. And I copied the format for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to write my script. Well, you may not know this, but William Goldman wrote the screenplay for Butch Cassidy in the wrong format. So I wrote my script in the wrong format. But despite that, and it was a little 40-page script, so too short to be a feature, too long to be a short film, absolutely useless. But it was based on I had worked in a slaughterhouse in between years in university. So it was sort of based on that. A fictional story set in this meatpacking plant. And I used that to get into graduate film school. And and when I was in graduate film school, my film prof, or my screenwriting prof, was also a producer at the CBC. So I gave him the little script and asked him to read it, and he did. And he invited me to see a pilot that he had made and maybe come up with an idea for an episode. So I went to the CBC, which back then was at 790 Bay Street, and was locked into a room with a VCR and a TV monitor to watch this pilot of a spy show called The Phoenix Team. And while I was waiting for them to unlock the door after I watched it, I came up with an idea, a vague idea, and they said, okay, come back in 2 days with a pitch. And I went, oh, it's a pitch? But I, somehow came up with something that I told them 2 days later, and they said, and Stanley Colbert, who was the producer, and Stanley Colbert is one of these guys, he produced Flipper. Remember Flipper? And then after producing Flipper in Florida, he moved to Canada and became this big shot producer at the CBC. So Stanley, and he's exactly like what you would expect him to be, brash, tough, no shit, producer. And he said, okay, kid, you just made yourself $1,200, which was the fee for commissioning a 1-hour drama from the CBC in 1979. And so that's how I started. And I never dreamed of being an actor or anything, but you know, I got my little typewriting exercise, got me a job writing this drama for the CBC, which got made. The director was Al Waxman, who had just finished, just retired from King of Kensington, which was a iconic CBC sitcom at the time. And it starred Don Franks and Elizabeth Shepard, and it was about a British spy and a Canadian spy who would meet every week for an affair and an adventure. And my adventure was about the Ku Klux Klan invading Canada to disrupt protesters. And I remember, and Phil Aiken, who is the founder of Obsidian Theater, a lot of the black artists in the room may know who he is. He was the guest star. He was like 24 years old at the time, playing this young spy in training. And I realized that the very first country that bought that show was an apartheid-era South Africa. And I know that whoever bought that show, when my episode aired, is probably was sent to jail because it was totally the wrong thing for apartheid South Africa. So I feel very proud of that because, you know, it shows the power of storytelling and being able to get something done that mattered to me. And who knows what yeah, that show was sold in 30 countries. I mean, Canadians even forget it was on. The CBC forgets they ever made it. But, you know, that's how I started. What happened was the second thing that I did was a movie for CBC that I wrote, which was set in my world. It was about an Indian guy who grew up in Canada. And it was a romantic comedy, and we couldn't find a brown actor in Canada to play the part. So the CBC sent Dorothy Gardner, who was the casting director for the network at the time, to Los Angeles to find a brown actor. And she came back and she said, "I found him." I said, "Wow, who's this brown actor in Los Angeles in 1982? His name is Howie Mandel." And I went, "I don't think that's an Indian name." And she went, no, he's a young comedian from North York. He's just moved there. This is before he was famous, by the way. He'd done nothing. And so, let's get worse. They sent, at taxpayer expense, the producer and the director, not the writer, to LA to audition a pre-famous Howie Mandel. And they hired a makeup person to paint him brown and paste a mustache on him. To their credit, the producer and director came back from LA that weekend and said, "We can't do this." At which point, John Kennedy, who ran the CBC drama department, said, "Then we have to cancel the movie. Sugith, your career is over." And I went, "Could I please audition?" And I begged them. It took a long time. They allowed me to audition. I think I had to audition 3 times, and they finally cast me. And that's how I started acting. Wow. I starred in this movie, and it was...
Yeah, round of applause for that. Round of applause for the tenacity. One, to put up your hand and say, "Hey," but also that you had to even put up your hand. I mean, I'm right here, looking in your face.
Well, I had no professional experience as an
Right.
actor. I was just a writer.
Right.
Which is why I still have the world's worst show business name, because I started as a writer. Nobody cares what the writer's called. But then, you know, on this movie, that's my name. Oh, great. Nothing anybody can spell or pronounce. I'm stuck. But then, you know, my next part was a one-line part. And I built a career of doing one-line parts for about 5 years. I didn't even have an agent. Back then, I walked door to door to the casting directors in town and gave them my one-line resume and picture and said, "You know, if you need anybody who looks like me, give me a call, because I know there's nobody else." And, I mean, you could never do that today. But John Buchan, who's still a casting director today, casts Transplant that I was on, he took pity and called me in for an audition for a one-line part in a TV show called Night Heat, which had just started, which was the beginning of sort of independent Canadian television production, because until then, the CBC was really the only game in town. And Don Shabib, who was a great Canadian director, who I'd studied in film school, was directing this episode, which taught me a lot about the Canadian film business right then and there. And he cast me with my one-line part. And Sonny Grosso was the producer of this series. And I don't know if you remember who Sonny Grosso was, but Sonny Grosso, in addition to bringing independent Canadian television production to Canada, was one of the two cops who, in real life, was in the French Connection. Roy Scheider plays him in the movie of French Connection. Anyway, so he's like one of these kind of guys, and once he cast you became part of his little rep company. So every 6 months or so, I'd get a call from John saying, there's a one-line part in another episode of Night Heat. Do you want to do it? And I said, yeah. So I'd go and do my one-line parts, and it took about 5 years. I finally had a collection of one-line part scenes to cut together in a reel, and that's how I got my first agent in 1989, who I'm still with.
Wow, that's amazing. That's incredible. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of adaptability, because you of course started off as a writer. You raised your hand and said, "Hey, I can do this part. I wrote it. I'm here. Let's audition."
Well, I mean, my feeling about any success I've had in Canadian show business is through diversification. I never made a living as any one thing, as an actor, or as a writer, or then as a director. I was the first minority to go to the Canadian Film Centre as a writer-director in the third year. Because I was required to have multiple hats and a multiple skill set, I could survive. When the acting was down, I got a writing job. When the writing was down, I got an acting job. When both were down, maybe I got a directing job. And that was the key to my success. And I've always felt, my story is about, writers must act, actors must write, directors must do both. Not necessarily professionally, but what it taught me is that it's the same job. It's all storytelling, and you understand storytelling, you can do those jobs. When I was on The Expanse, I talked to Joanne, who is the costume designer. She's a storyteller. She just tells the story through wardrobe. And if you work on any of these shows with these great people, from lighting to wardrobe to makeup, they're all storytellers. And so if you understand storytelling, that's the key to the job. The skill, the specific skill, how to hit your mark if you're an actor or whatever. I mean, you can teach you that in half an hour. But what is a career is learning how to be a storyteller.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I feel like you are a better storyteller when you can kind of jump into all of those different roles because you understand.
Well, I don't know if you're a better storyteller, but they're all the same job. In other words, storytelling as an actor is storytelling in front of the camera. Storytelling as a writer is storytelling on paper, but it's filmmaking on paper. Storytelling as a director, you're behind the camera. The editor is a storyteller after the camera finishes rolling. And all these departments, they're all essentially storytellers. They're not technicians, so to speak. I mean, they're using technical expertise to achieve this goal of telling the story. So they all understand the story first and foremost. And that's what makes them employable. And I think that's what made me employable was my storytelling skill, not necessarily my great talent as an actor or anything. You know what I mean? And it also made me a really good collaborator. So when I talk to a director, when I talk to a writer, when I talk to an actor, in whatever those capacities, we're talking story.
Right. Just from a different perspective.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the evolution of technology, because one thing that you mentioned is the fact that when you started, you had a typewriter, you had, didn't have access to what we have nowadays. The internet, we have our phones in our pockets that we can create content with. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about how you think that this has changed the landscape for new filmmakers and writers today compared to when you started?
Well, it has and it hasn't. I mean, I was one of the original writers of Fraggle Rock, which was shot here. But we had to, thank you. And when I started writing Fraggle Rock, it was 1983, before computers. I mean, the Mac hadn't been invented yet. I got an original IBM PC in season 2, I think, and that's when I started using a computer. But until then, we were typewriting our scripts. I remember my third script, I was literally cutting and pasting. And it was in trouble, and I was going to be, the script was going to be canceled if I didn't get this script right. And I spent the weekend cutting and pasting different drafts, and I'm literally cutting and pasting and writing in the margins and all this stuff. And I brought this 30-page script to my mentor and boss, Jerry Jewell, and it's this thick because it's all full of glue. And I gave it to him, and he goes, okay. And he goes into his office, and I paced for 40 minutes until he came out, and he said, nice save. But, you know, so a computer makes that process easier. But a computer doesn't make you a good storyteller. You know, I wish I could push funny on the computer keyboard, but that hasn't changed anything. No. And so, you know, and this iPhone that I carry around is about 40 times better than the cameras that we used in graduate school to learn cinematography on. But unless you understand storytelling, you can go on TikTok and see the various levels of storytelling available to you. Yeah. You know, the technology is only a tool. The great thing about this, for this generation, is that they have access that I couldn't even dream of. They can make the movie. They don't need to, you know, hit a gatekeeper and find a funder and all that stuff. Really, you can do it and put it on YouTube and become rich and famous anyway. It's the quality of the content, not the technology that matters. And I'm very jealous of everybody in this room because I didn't have that luxury.
Right, right. And I know that with your background from one of our previous conversations, you talked about how your story is your story. And you feel like it could be hard for maybe someone to take your story and use it as a blueprint to how they can make it.
Yeah, I mean, how I broke into the business and how I did. I mean, there's so much, you know, particular circumstance and luck. Oh my God, so much luck and being in the right place at the right time. I mean, look, the prerequisites are talent and hard work, no question. But unfortunately, I know lots of people who have more talent and work harder than I ever did, but they aren't as lucky, you know. So I don't, you know, that's something you can't buy. But you can be prepared for when luck happens. And that, I would say, is the biggest gap that I see with young film people is, you know, the lack of preparation. I mean, you know, somebody asked me once, well, what's the best advice you would give somebody who wants to do what you do? I said, read. I said, what? Read. You know, read. They have access, like, you know, I had to go to the bookstore and find the 2 published screenplays that only ever existed when I started. Now you have 70,000 screenplays on the internet that you can download for free, or read Shakespeare, or read, you know, all of that stuff. I mean, there's no excuse for, it doesn't cost you anything to be that prepared, to understand the terms of reference, to understand who what the great works are in our industry, to emulate, to steal from Fellini, to steal from Scorsese, to steal from Robert Towne, you know, whoever, and to figure out how to tell your story. And I mean, that's something everybody is capable of doing now in a way that I could never even have dreamt of when I started. So, you know, that you can do. You may not get greenlit from telefilm, but you can know that you're ready if greenlit by telefilm.
And, you know, obviously you mentioned having a bit of that luck. You also mentioned, you know, for 5 years doing the one-liners. How did you keep yourself motivated during that time for those people that may not have found that luck just yet, but they haven't?
Well, you know, I can't, all I ever wanted was to be on set. And after 10 years in the business, I counted the number of days that I was on set as a writer or for something I'd written or something I was acting in or something I got to direct. And after 10 years, I counted I had been on set 75 days. And that was enough. It was enough to make a living because, you know, if you're in the union, you go on set, you make a good living for the day. And my expenses were low back then. But more importantly, it was enough fulfillment, right? 75 days out of 10 years of doing what I wanted to do was enough. I don't know if that's true for everybody, but if it isn't true for you, you're going to have a tough time.
Absolutely, absolutely. My next question for you, we talked a bit about diversity. You've been referred to as the OG of diversity on screen. So, of course, it's quite the title.
No. The OG, I was called the OG once. I was doing a play with Who's Madhavji, and he called me I was sitting around telling stories in the dressing room, and he called me the OG, and I'm so OG, I thought he meant old guy.
Oh. Well, now that you understand what OG means, what does that label mean to you? And how do you feel about the current state of diversity in the industry?
I started before diversity was a thing. So, and I'm grateful to have lived long enough for diversity to be a thing. And we're all beneficiaries of that. I was never hired. I mean, I wasn't hired by Jim Henson because I was brown, and I think I was lucky. But now, after a while, I realized there's a lot of white guys who are getting hired, and it's not because, you know what I mean? Like so there is a need for us to acknowledge that we are a diverse culture, and just because you're not a mainstream white Anglo-Saxon male doesn't mean you should be second class in terms of opportunity. And so, I've been going to these panels for 40 years, complaining, asking nicely, and asking nicely doesn't work. And I'm glad we've reached the point where, for whatever reason, it is now, a given that we are a diverse community, both culturally and in terms of population, and that diversity should be reflected on screen. I was talking to Brent Banbury at CBC Radio on the weekend, and I told him about, I grew up in Saskatoon, and I only saw brown people on screen when I turned 11, or when I was 11, and my parents took me to the University of Saskatchewan Film Society because they brought in an Indian movie, and it was an old black and white art film. And I watched this Indian movie at 11 years old, and I saw brown people from 20 years earlier in India. So it's completely foreign in every way, other than the fact that they were brown. And it took my breath away. And I realized, oh my God, when I go to James Bond or Westerns, I'm doing work that my friends aren't having to do, to see themselves or to project themselves into that movie. And I realized I am invisible in my own country, in my culture, and that's not fair. So I think that's when I was motivated to go into Canadian show business, because I didn't want to be invisible, and if I didn't do it, who else would? Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's so important to be able to be, in the room and around the table to tell your story, especially as a Canadian.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, there are a lot of people who think, oh, we got to move to LA, and there is a reason to do that. I just felt that I was Canadian. I was born in India, but I grew up in Canada. My values are Canadian, my experience is Canadian, my friends are Canadian, my community is Canadian. And I didn't feel like I should have to leave my own country in order to make a living or in order to have an opportunity. And so on some level, I stuck around to create my own opportunities, and that's how it worked out. And now I think there's so much opportunity that, we have this kind of, like, this is a picture I couldn't have seen 25 years ago.
Let's talk a little bit about your creative process. How do you continue to bring your story and your experiences into your work when you're writing and when you're acting?
Well, writing's really hard. I stare at a computer screen until beads of blood pop out on my forehead. And I wish I was getting better at it. I know more about writing now. I know what good is, and I keep aspiring to that. But it's really hard. I rely a lot on what I was taught when I worked for the Muppets in terms of how to tell a story for the screen. And I've applied that to trying to tell my own story. And I think that's a really useful thing. You know, we are giving access to emerging filmmakers now in a way that I never could have dreamt of. But the responsibility for knowing how to tell a story that transcends your own experience, but that can appeal to a wide audience, is a real skill that needs to be learned. And just because your story is your story doesn't mean you're able to tell it in a way that appeals to somebody who doesn't love you. And that's the job. And so I'm grateful for having sort of learned on the job how to tell a story, so now I can apply those skills to telling my story. And I think that's a useful thing to have. So that's my approach to the writing part of it. In terms of acting, you know, I never planned to be an actor. I did go to drama school, but I studied directing and dramaturgy. I never took an acting class. I did study voice and I did study oral interpretation, but those are sort of side skills for acting. But I still use them. And that's something that I realized, again, getting back to this idea of storytelling being the job, because I think what I brought to acting is a storytelling sensibility, as opposed to whatever acting classes teach you, because I don't know what they teach you, because I never got taught that. But it's that storytelling sensibility that I would bring to acting, you know, understanding the text, understanding who that character is, and then being in the moment. You know, I once directed films for children with children, you know, 12-year-olds, 6th graders in the cast. And they were used to doing school plays, and they'd never acted in a TV show before. So I tried to help them. I said, look, I want you to go through your script, and in every scene you're in, on the right-hand side of the page, or sorry, left-hand side of the page, write the answers to 3 questions. The first question is, what just happened? Answer that. Second question is, how do I feel? And the third question is, what do I want? And write those answers on the side of the page, so that whenever we shoot that scene, because we're going to be shooting them out of order, you'll be able to know, okay, what just happened? My mom yelled at me. How do I feel? Angry. What do I want? Revenge. Whatever, you know, and it allowed those kids to then go into the scene. I didn't have to teach them, you know, sort of how to imagine being a tree or whatever they teach you in acting classes. You know, I was trying to give them a practical
yeah.
you know, approach
yep.
to like shooting this TV show.
Yeah.
And it was very helpful, I think, for them, and it made me realize that's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
You know, I should write a book. It's a one-page book, but you know, that's really the job. Everything else is being truthful. Yeah. Everything else is being in the moment. So, and truthful is another dodgy word, in that people think truthful means natural, and it doesn't. You know, as an actor, like I was in Kim's Convenience. At the same time, I was in a show called Transplant, and they're very different shows. My job in both was to be truthful, but the truthfulness of a Kim's Convenience is a different tone, a different, you know, world than the truthfulness of Transplant, and so truthfulness is a big word, and I think a lot of people confuse truthfulness for naturalness, and naturalness isn't necessarily truthful, you know. So that's the approach to acting. Is really preparation and presence.
I mean, when you break it down for a 6-year-old, I feel like, oh, okay, I get that. I think maybe I could try my hand. That might be, you know, maybe a one line, you know, maybe. You know, take a page out of your one page out of your book. So you paved the way, of course, for many aspiring artists from different backgrounds. So I want to talk a little bit about what advice you'd give to young filmmakers and writers who are just kind of starting out their career.
Well, I get back to read. You know, there's so many other things that are not in your control, but educating yourself isn't. That's in your control, and reading is going to expand your terms of reference and your artistic vision far more than anything else, I think. The other thing is, say yes. I said yes. I seldom said no. Say yes no matter what it is, particularly when you're starting out, you have no idea. First of all, you have no idea what you don't know, and that you will learn doing that. Secondly, you have no idea where it will go. I can't tell you the number of times I've said yes to some low budget, no budget thing, and we were talking about that in the session this morning. It's on Hollywood Suite now, right? I mean, you know, so, you know, be prepared and be open. And everything else is out of your hands.
Yeah. Yeah, saying yes is, I'm telling you, just from my experience as a broadcaster, you know, when I finished school, I never imagined that I would be a traffic reporter, okay? You told me go north on, I was like, what are you talking about? I am not a compass. What are you know what I mean? So I finished broadcast or journalism school, and I ended up being a traffic reporter on 680 News, and then from there, so I said yes to that. I actually told them, I don't know. And they're like, we've taught people greener than you. No problem. I was like, okay. So I went on their big radio, and I did, you know, traffic when I had no idea. And I was learning on the job. And then through that, I was able to get to breakfast television and do traffic there for 7 years. So, you know, you don't know what you don't know. You just say yes, and you know, you can become a pro and learn on the job as you go, and you're moving through, you know, your experience.
Look, I wanted an Oscar before I was 30, and I still have the speech. But
Give us
that's
a piece of the speech.
That's not going to happen now. But you know, the thing is, I couldn't have written in advance the story of my career. And I look at it and I go, how did I pull this off? Because it's so much serendipity. But at the same time, on some level, it's a straight line. Because of you know, the stuff I was talking about. Like I wanted to get into Canadian, or into film and television. I didn't have any other option that I knew of other than typing up a script. And here we are 40 years later. You know, I mean, I sort of did it. That's how it started. It started with me staring, you know.
Yeah. And if you were to look back at the history of your career, you know, was there anything that you would change?
Well, sure. There's a lot of rejections that I would like to redo. There's a lot of no's that I got that I would like to have some conversations about. But, you know, it all meant that that's who I ended up being as a person. I mean, you know, the real job in this business is to grow. That's why we're here. And if you're not able to grow in what you're doing, then what's the point? There's easier ways to make a living. So it's that expansion of who you are as a person. I mean, I couldn't have this conversation 40 years ago. I was dumb as mud. But you know, that growth that I think I experienced doing what I did over 40 years, you know, has made me a bigger person, and so there's a point to having lived for 40 years. And you don't know that when you're 22 years old. You know, that's not the goal, but that's actually the end game, I think.
Absolutely. So let's think ahead now about the legacy. What's the legacy that you hope to leave with the industry? It's a big question.
That's a big question.
It's a big question.
Well, I hope that, you know, one of the things is I don't have kids, so whatever I do leave beyond me is the body of work. So I hope that the body of work matters and stands. Excuse me. I mean, one of my concerns is I started so long ago that those early shows, you know, like the Howie Mandel movie, you know, you can't see it. It doesn't stream anywhere. It sits in the CBC archives, and they're not going to show it again. And the reason is because in the movie, I sang one bar from Singin' in the Rain, you know the song? Singin' in the Rain, so singing it. I just literally did that. And to re-clear the rights to get Singin' in the Rain again is so much money that the CBC will never show that movie again.
Oh, no.
Even though it's a pioneering work that,
Never.
you know, was the first multicultural movie ever made in Canada by the CBC, before the movie Gandhi, before the movie My Beautiful Laundrette, before the Brits were doing anything like that, way before the Americans. The CBC did it first, but thanks to Singing in the Rain, if I knew that at the time, I would have sung something else. But,
Something cheaper.
you know, so that's the downside of all of having a long career, is that, you know, these stuff, and I don't even know if I can access my scripts from back then, because they were, you know, written on DOS 2.1, and, you know, like who knows? So I would say there is a legacy that may, you know, require an archaeologist to dig out in the future. But I'm glad I did it. I know what I did, and it mattered to me. If it matters to anybody else, that's a bonus. But, you know, like I said, I didn't do it for legacy. I did it for, you know, to express myself, to fulfill, you know, to not be invisible, and that mattered. Thank you.
Round of applause. Yeah. I mean, everything you've done, it ends up being a legacy. You've paved the way for so many people, and you're an inspiration to so many people, especially in this room and beyond this room, of course.
Well, like I said, being in Canadian show business is like being in witness protection. So,
You're not wrong.
so you know, having this kind of recognition is a tremendous, like, you know, I won't sleep tonight, because it's like, whoa, how did that happen? But so I really appreciate what you're saying. But, you know, legacy. Royalties are better than legacy. Let's say that.
On that note, Sugith, I want to congratulate you again for your award, and
Thank you.
I would like to now invite Vanessa Case, Vice President of Content, Paramount Plus, and Pluto TV Canada, to present this award to Sugith.
Oh.
Thank you. I took it out of the box today, so I get to officially congratulate you on your Award of Excellence. I think everybody will agree you are a fabulous storyteller, and we could sit here much longer and keep listening to the history that you've had, and thank you so much for sharing your story with us on behalf of Paramount, but on also our participation with Reelworld. We're just so thankful that you came today, and congratulations.
Oh, thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.
Just. I just want to thank you again. I want to thank Tanya and Reelworld for this really, really unexpected honor, and I'm totally overwhelmed. I wish my parents were around to see this, but they're watching from heaven. So, but thank you all very much. Yeah.